So it seems rather fitting to be talking about money in a city which is obsessed with it, really. And I think all of us are some way obsessed about money. But we're more specifically interested in payment technologies, which is why we're here talking to you today about mobile point of sales terminals. So mobile point of sales terminals has seen a huge growth over the last few years. We've moved from a single vendor dominating the marketplace to multiple vendors. You can now get hold of an account in less than 5 minutes, and readers typically cost less than $50 to purchase. It's for these reasons that we've seen an exponential growth in this area. You can find these devices everywhere. So in taxis, cafes, and I've even found them in my local gym. For this reason, and because they sit at the endpoint of payment infrastructure, they're also very attractive to criminals, both for the testing of cards and for the movement of money. But we weren't the first to investigate mobile point of sales terminals. In 2014, MWR Labs presented their findings on the Mura shuttle reader, which at the time was effectively being white-labeled by a number of vendors. This kind of practice is still commonplace today. In their presentation, they detailed a number of vulnerabilities, of which there is a lot of overlap with traditional point-of-sales terminals. Then in 2015, 3 undergraduate students from the University of Boston presented their findings on the magstripe reader by Square. We felt that both of these projects were really significant contributions in this area, but they don't really deal with the broader, more contemporary issues associated with this marketplace. So the sophistication of these readers has increased incredibly over the last few years, as has the number of vendors. At the beginning of this project, we started with just 2 terminals and 2 vendors. This quickly grew into a large project encompassing 7 card readers, 4 vendors, and 2 different regions. We chose to carry out a broad assessment of the most popular devices in both Europe and the US. We chose to focus on PayPal, Square, iZettle, and SumUp. Some of these vendors exist in both geographic locations, so where this was the case, we chose, where possible, to obtain accounts and readers in both geographic locations. This is because there are some fundamental differences between the processes, applications, and the readers, depending on the region. We had a basic understanding of the attack vectors that these readers were affected by, but we wanted to see how practical these attacks were in practice. Still, our key question remained: how much security can really be embedded in a device that's available for free? We chose to assess 5 areas of the payment ecosystem. The first being between the phone and the payment server. Next, between the terminal and the phone. The mobile application and the associated mobile ecosystem. The physical security mechanisms within the hardware of the card readers themselves. And then secondary factors which affect the overall risk and security of the payment ecosystem. For example, the kind of checks that are carried out during the enrollment process. But before we progress any further, I'll just give you a bit of background information on how payments typically work with a traditional point-of-sales terminal and how mobile point-of-sales terminals fit into this process. So normally when we go into a business and we pay for some goods, we'll either interact with the terminal directly or we'll hand our card over to the merchant. Once our card information has been read, this will be passed to the acquiring bank for the merchant. At this point, they don't actually know who our issuing bank is, so they'll ask the card brands, such as Visa and MasterCard, to determine this information. Once this has been passed to your issuing bank, they'll check that you have the necessary funds to complete the transaction and carry out some fraud checks. If they're happy for you to go ahead, they'll send the response back along the chain and you can complete the payment. If we take a look at what this looks like for a mobile point of sales terminal provider, we can see that the key difference is that the merchant no longer has a direct relationship with the acquirer. Instead, the mobile point of sales terminal provider acts as a payment aggregator. This means that they will or won't assess risk at the same level as a traditional acquiring bank. And they may also choose to mitigate some of the risk in other ways, for example, contractually. When you go to make a transaction, there is a list that broadly describes the types of operations from highest priority to lowest priority. This list differs depending on the issuer, the card brand, and potentially the geographic region as well. But generally speaking, we can understand that certain payment types are more risky than others. For example, chip and PIN is considered most secure. This is because there's a high level of assurance that the cardholder was present during the transaction. Whereas something such as magstripe is considered low in its level of security. This is because the magnetic stripe on the back of the card can be cloned, a signature can obviously be forged without much effort, and there's no signing of the transaction, there's no cryptogram like modern transactions. Next, we need to understand that while generally speaking, EMV has been adopted very successfully on a global scale, it's taken a bit longer in some places than others. So in the US, EMV adoption has taken a little bit longer than places like Europe. What's interesting about this fact is that we can look to places like Europe and look at the kind of attack vectors that are being utilized by criminals there and use them as a good predictor about what may happen in the US. As you can see, credit card adoption of EMV is actually incredibly high at 96%. But when we look at how often a chip is used during a transaction, it's actually less than 50% of transactions in the US. This picture is even worse when we come to talk about debit cards. Less than a quarter of all transactions are made using a chip. If we look at the growth of mobile point of sales terminals within only a couple of years, it's quite incredible, really. So by 2019, mobile point of sales terminals are projected to contribute to almost 50% of all transactions made by a terminal. So how do these devices work? So this schematic overview represents how each of the components communicate with each other. The terminal communicates to the phone and the mobile application via Bluetooth, which in turn communicates to the payment server over a network connection or over Wi-Fi. So now that we have a broad understanding of how the payment ecosystem works and how mobile point of sales terminals fit into this process, we can begin to discuss our findings. We'll be talking about the sending of arbitrary commands, which you can use to socially engineer a cardholder. For example, we can send a message to a payment display which says payment declined and get a cardholder to carry out additional transactions. Then we will talk about how for certain transaction types, we can actually modify the transaction value, thus displaying a lower value on the terminal screen and forcing the cardholder to carry out a much higher value transaction. We will talk about how we obtain remote code execution on one of the readers that we looked at, which provides full access to the file system. So with this kind of attack vector, you pretty much have access to everything, so we can collect track 2 information before it's even encrypted. Then we will discuss the security mechanisms within the hardware of the terminals themselves. And finally, we will discuss secondary factors. Bluetooth is the main form of communication between the phone and the reader and the mobile application. Therefore, it's really important for us to have an understanding of how the protocol works. So let's make a brief overview of the protocol stack. Bluetooth can be roughly divided into 2 separate areas. So we have the host and the controller layers. The Bluetooth profiles and GATT and ATS deal with the actual transfer of information. Then we have L2CAP, which deals with the segmentation and reassembly of packets. Then we have the host controller layer, host controller interface, or HCI, which is the lowest level that we can directly interact with without specialist equipment. So this is commonly used for debugging by developers, but if you're a security researcher, it's particularly helpful to have access to this because you can start to understand some of the functions of the device. Then we have the link manager protocol, which deals with pairing, negotiation, and encryption. We have baseband, which is the last layer of framing before Bluetooth radio itself. When we talk about Bluetooth, we're actually talking about two different protocols, Bluetooth Classic and Bluetooth Low Energy. Bluetooth Classic uses Bluetooth profiles to communicate with. All of the devices that we looked at that use Bluetooth Classic use RF-COM. So what this does is it simulates a serial port between the reader and the mobile application. So this means we can send large amounts of data between the two devices. On the other hand, Bluetooth Low Energy only allows for the small sending of data. This is used as a hierarchical structure under which services and characteristics are defined. Each characteristic has a unique value and properties such as read, write, and notify. If you want to attack a Bluetooth device or just communicate with it, we obviously need to know what the address is made up of. So the Bluetooth address is made up of three main parts. We have the non-significant address part, which isn't significant for any functions, the upper address part, and the lower address part. The lower address part is present in every frame and it's unique to the specific device. The non-significant address part and upper address part is what is known as the organizationally unique ID, or OUI. So if you know what this information is, so if you have a range of these for vendors, it's possible to sit in a public place and identify potentially vulnerable devices. A Bluetooth network is also made up of a master and slave model. So one master can have up to 7 slaves. There are many different Bluetooth attack vectors, but we'll be focusing on 2. So the first is man in the middle or eavesdropping, and the next is malicious device manipulation. So with eavesdropping, you're trying to intercept the communication between the master and the slave and decrypt the communication. If you want to manipulate the device maliciously, you can just connect to the device. But in order to carry out that kind of attack, we need to carry out some prerequisite work. For man-in-the-middle attacks, you require specialist equipment. So the equipment that you require to carry out these kind of attacks depends on the Bluetooth type. So for Bluetooth Classic, using an enhanced data rate, it's not very affordable for most of us here in the room to carry out these kind of attacks, because typically you need specialist equipment like the BPA 600, which costs $20,000. But on the other hand, if you look at Bluetooth Low Energy, you can use the Texas Instruments CC2540 development kit or an Ubertooth 1. But these kind of attack vectors aren't really that viable. They're quite complex to do. And we're talking about card readers here, which means that all pertinent information between the card reader and the payment server is likely to be encrypted. So for this reason, it's not a viable attack method for us. So just a special note on enhanced data rates, because there isn't too much information online about devices using enhanced data rates. How do you know if your device supports this and whether it's outside of your reach to actually carry an attack on a device like this? The first thing you can do is you can run a reconnaissance scan, and you'll see that EDR is listed as a feature under the response. The second thing that you need to do, just to confirm that this is the case, is if you capture some of the packets using a tool like Ubertooth, you'll notice that you're only seeing the data headers and none of the data payloads. So in this way, you can confirm that it's not a realistic attack for you. So this brings us on to our first finding, which is the sending of arbitrary commands. So as I mentioned, this allows us to socially engineer a card holder. So we may get them to carry out a less secure payment method, or we could get them to carry out additional transactions. So if we connect directly to a device, what could we do? We can get it to initiate a payment, for example. We could display some text on the device. We can turn it off and on. But we need to consider that the pairing process might introduce some obstacles for us. It's worth noting for developers that user authentication and input sanitization doesn't actually happen in Bluetooth itself, so you have to implement this at the application level. So in order to carry out this attack, we need to carry out some prerequisite work so that we understand how the device works and what each of the functions are responsible for. So a bit of reverse engineering. All that we need to do that is we need a mobile phone or a cell phone, which has the ability to enable enhanced features, developers options specifically. Then we need to enable HCI logging on the phone. You'll also need access to the mobile application for the card reader, and you'll need access to the card reader itself. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to capture a sample of operations. So the easiest way to do this is just to carry out some transactions with the reader. Once we've captured this information, you can import it into tools such as Wireshark, as you can see here, and you can analyze the output. So using this information and the information in the mobile application, it's possible to reverse many of the functions of the device. So here we can see the sending of insert or swipe card to the display. So in this next example, I've actually inserted my card incorrectly into this reader, and it's presented the message, please remove card. We can see that there's 2 packets responsible for the sending of this information. That's because this terminal is using Bluetooth Low Energy and it has quite a low packet size. And we can also see the corresponding UUID for the value sent. So we need to know this information in order to communicate with the device. So if we look at this example in greater detail, you can see it's actually made up of 5 parts. The first is a leading value, and this contains a command ID, a counter value, and the intended payload size. Then we have the message, which is please remove card, and this is in ASCII. Then we have a trailing part, a checksum, which is in X modem, and then we have an end value. So once you know this information, so for this particular terminal, it's possible for us to calculate any number of values to send to the display. We don't have to send please remove card or insert or swipe card. We can just do anything with it. So we found that 3 of the terminals that we looked at were vulnerable to this kind of attack with a display. So as I mentioned, we could use this to send a message such as please swipe your card, and therefore force a cardholder to swipe their card instead of using their chip. We can also send a message such as payment cancelled or payment declined, and therefore make them carry out an additional transaction. So let's see what this looks like in action. So here I'm going to send a message to display to tell the cardholder that they instead need to actually swipe their card to carry out this transaction. So in this next example, we can see this specific terminal is using Bluetooth Classic, which is why it looks a little bit different from the previous example. And here you can see the message, which is insert or swipe card. If we look at what this consists of, it's similar to the previous example. So we have a command ID and a counter value and a payload size in the leading part. And then we have the message, which is in ASCII as well, which says insert or swipe card. And then we have a simple XOR value for the checksum. So again, what we can do is, now that we know this information for this terminal, we can calculate any kind of values that we want. So in this example, what you're going to see is that the cardholder is going to try and make a transaction using contactless, but we're going to interrupt the payment process. We're going to tell them that the payment has in fact been declined. But the payment has actually been authorized, which we will see in a moment, because we're going to receive a text message or an SMS message on the display of the phone. So you can see that that payment did actually go through, but we're able to interrupt the payment process. So this brings us on to our next finding, which is amount modification. So we're going to use the information that we've learnt about in the first section around sending arbitrary commands to work out how to modify the amount for certain transaction values.
Yeah. Now let's try to affect payment process and payment comments. So actually there are a lot of ways to intercept comments as well as tamper them and just reverse engineer them. So first of all comments are going from a server side to the phone, which means if we will use HTTPS main in the middle, we will be able to intercept them. For this purpose, you just need to bypass SSL pinning in most of the cases, and there are a lot of ways to do this. Next method was already mentioned, is like the easiest one, to enable HCI login and then get access to traffic and read it via Wireshark. Next, you also can rebuild an APK in a mobile application, enable debugging messages, and then get access to them via Android debug bridge. This method is also very useful, for example, to get information about commands, some information in source code, so very good. And finally, if you don't have any other options, you still can use external device, which also was mentioned, for example, Ubuntu. So here are two examples of payment commands from two different readers. And for both readers, we choose two channels of information. So in the first case, we enabled HCI login and rebuilt an application. And you can see that the value which is responsible for amount, which will be displayed on the reader, is stored in a hex, so 02EE. In second case, we also rebuilt an application and got access to the traffic via HTTPS main in the middle. And in that case, information was sent in plain text, so amount was sent 0100. And as you can see, just all you need to send arbitrary amount, you just need to change these bytes and then recalc a checksum. So what actually will happen if a fraudulent merchant will tamper an amount between phone and the reader? So he shows lower amount to a customer and force customer to make payment for a lower amount, but actually he will send a higher value amount to a service provider. That's exactly what we do. So we send £1.23 to a server side, to a service provider, but customer see and confirm only £1 transaction. And you don't even need to forge a signature because there will be a genuine signature of a customer. So this fraudulent attack and this fraudulent payment will pass at least for a max stripe. Why? Well, because in all of these devices, during max stripe transaction, reader sends only track to data. When, for example, for EMV transactions, actual amount, currency, and other information will be stored inside of a payment cryptogram. For contactless transactions, there are also certain modes, legacy modes, which can be affected because they also don't send information about amount inside of a payment cryptogram. And last problem is that limits for all kind of payments for service providers are just completely insane. For like up to $50,000, euros or pounds, depends on the region. Which means that service providers rely on an acquiring or issuing bank in terms of blocking of suspicious transactions. Okay, so let's imagine ourselves. We can open a merchant account in less than 5 minutes. Then we are going to force customer to use less secure form of payment, for example, swipe instead of chip and pin. Then we are going to show him completely arbitrary amount on a screen of reader and mobile phone, like $1, for example. But in fact, we will be going to carry out a transaction for up to 50,000 at a time. And last problem is that this fraudulent transaction can be made with some significant delays. For example, we carried it out with 10 minutes of delay, which means customer has already swiped card and has already left the building, and 10 minutes later, merchant does the transaction. What we will recommend? Well, first of all, even if you as a service provider don't have access to a firmware and you can modify the specification of communication between reader and the phone, you still can mitigate these risks and, for example, control your mobile ecosystem and should not allow to use rooted devices because, as you saw, rooted device is just a direct way to reverse engineer all the protocol and get access to the whole traffic. For customers, recommendations are much easier. Just do not use MaxStripe. But we also found that sometimes it's much easier to get a full control over a mobile point of sale terminal than over traditional terminals. So for this purpose, all you need is just to get a good reverse engineer and obtain to him an encrypted firmware so he can work on something. Let's try to discuss how to obtain a firmware and how firmware updating process works in the readers. So obviously firmware is stored on the server side, which means it will be going to a mobile phone via HTTPS and then via Bluetooth to a reader, which means we are going to get access to it exactly the same way as to every other commands, for example via HTTPS main in the middle. In some cases, updating process and configuration files are sent as a set of encrypted commands. Sometimes they are going to a reader as a links to encrypted firmware, as you see here. And in this case, you can try to enumerate versions of firmware on the server side, for example, to obtain some older versions, some vulnerable debugging versions. But sometimes you don't even need this. So all you need is just to use Google and find GitHub repositories which will be stored of an encrypted firmware, older versions, vulnerable versions, whatever. So what firmware and encrypted firmware will contain? Well, first of all, it's a whole set of configuration files which says what messages are going to be displayed, what kind of operations are going to be done. That means that if you change modify the configuration file, you will be able to disable chip and pin, for example, on the reader. And finally, it is a whole set of binary files which can be used to reverse engineer them and find some vulnerabilities like remote code execution, buffer, stack overflow. So exactly what our reverse engineer did. So he found out-of-date firmware and found remote code execution there and were able to exploit it via Bluetooth. So in the end, we got a root access to via Bluetooth on a reader, which was pretty good because initially we didn't expect anything like that. Why it is a holy grail to get a full control over a mobile point of sale terminal. One of my favorite cases is when in 2014 it was very unusual type of fraud in Brazil. When hackers used infected mobile point of sale, probably they infected it pretty much the same way as we did, and carried out fraudulent transactions with stolen track-to data. But the problem was that even that they sent only track-to data inside of payment information, they said to bank that operations were chip and pin. And the most curious part was that genuine cards didn't even have chip and pin on board, chip on board, which means that's how basically bank figured out that it was just a fraud. Next, of course, we can start to collect track-to data before it will be encrypted on a reader, as well as try to intercept pin codes unencrypted from chip and pin. So how to do this? Mobile point of sale terminals work pretty much the same way as traditional terminals or ATMs. So PinPad has two modes, encrypted mode and plain text mode. And if you will get control over a binary file which is responsible for switching between these two modes, you can manipulate this information and basically force a customer to use to send PIN code unencrypted. And finally, this small device is very useful to understand how payment process works, how payment researchers were working, and to make your own payment research, so basically exactly what we did. Last problem is that how to keep persistence on a device, because, for example, in our case, device after rebooting were checking their own integrity and were not allowed to use random files on a file system. So we bypassed this check, and next we found another problem, that mobile application also has to check out-of-date firmware and should not allow to use reader with out-of-date firmware in the ecosystem of mobile point of sale. But the problem was that this check was bypassed in a very, very silly way, let's say. So all you had to do is just to drop a packet with request or response from a mobile phone to a server about version of firmware, and mobile phone like took 2-3 seconds of timeout and like, oh, okay, I don't know what firmware version is, I'm ready to work. which means you can use this infected device in the ecosystem for a long, long time. So what for? In this scenario, you can imagine that fraudulent customer can come up to a merchant, get a physical access to a reader for a couple seconds, switch on pairing mode, because in this case he had to enable pairing mode, connect his own malicious device, and downgrade the firmware. And after that, he could send an exploit to get device infected, bypass updating process after rebooting, and start to collect track 2 data, for example, for a long, long time in merchants' hands. Well, in this case, what we recommend to vendors is obviously, first of all, it is very important to control that your customers should not use out-of-date firmware, as well as to allow them to downgrade firmware, because it sounds completely unnecessary, right? What we also found in the market is a very unusual case when one particular vendor checked potentially infected devices, and if potentially infected devices were connected with each other even once, like a mobile phone with a reader or reader with account, all these entities appear to be blocked and potentially infected. So this is very good practice that we found on the market. And of course, finally, as soon as we got a remote code execution on the reader, we could not resist to put more cats on the internet. And finally, about hardware. Yeah, surprisingly, for these devices which cost like 50 pounds or less, an actual physical level of security is pretty good, because most of them had some anti-tampering mechanisms like anti-tampering circuit, protection against, which will control against and protect system against drilling, opening, sometimes even pressure sensors. And the last problem is that even if you will open a device without alerting of anti-tampering mechanisms, all you will find is only a set of proprietary protocols, sometimes no JTAG, which means that without developers' documentation, without developer certificates, you hardly will get anything.
So this brings us on to our secondary factors. As we mentioned in the past, there are significant differences between the vendors that we looked at. So some of the vendors place primary emphasis on the onboarding checks. Others instead prefer to focus on transaction monitoring, such as the correlation that Tim mentioned. There are also significant differences depending on the geographic location. Generally speaking, we noted that readers and accounts in Europe were far more restrictive than those in US. Lastly, we were rarely disappointed, in fact, to find that most of the vendors that we looked at chose not to protect the mobile ecosystem. One of the vendors that we spoke to mentioned that they'd chosen to do this because they considered this environment already compromised. The problem with this kind of approach is that by providing access to some of these features in the mobile ecosystem, it means that good guys like us and bad guys can reverse the functions of your application and your reader much easier. So this table represents a broad overview of all the different readers, manufacturers, vendors, and the assessment points that we looked at. Obviously, this marketplace places an emphasis on ease of enrollment, but it doesn't take into account that, in fact, security should be incredibly high in all areas in order to counteract the incredibly low barriers for processing cardholder payments. So a unique opportunity presented itself during this project. We noted that these particular devices would allow us to carry out the kind of activities we would normally carry out during red teaming, but outside of the scope of a normal customer engagement. So you don't have to work in a financial organization. You can simply open an account and get access to one of these readers. This means that all of us in this room here can start to carry out our own payment research. We can also just confirm our understanding of existing research or just how a transaction works in practice. So what does this mean for assessing risk for someone's business? It means that if you process cardholder payments, you shouldn't carry out swipe transactions. Beyond the vulnerability that we mentioned that's present in many of these readers, this protocol is deprecated. So this means, again, that the mag stripe can be cloned, a signature can be forged, and of course there's no signing of the transaction. So as a merchant, every time you take a swipe transaction, you're actually accepting liability for the full value of the transaction. But more broadly speaking, it means for other industries, we've seen over the last few years that embedded systems or IoT products have become incredibly popular with both consumers and businesses. But we need to understand that the level of security testing in the development of these products is probably not going to be that great, especially when most of the companies have only been around for a couple of years. And many of these products retail for less than a couple of $100s. So at the beginning of this project, we started with just 2 card readers, but this quickly grew into a very large project encompassing 7 readers, 4 vendors, and 2 regions. So what did we find? We found that over half of all of the readers are affected by some attack vector or some vulnerability, and all of the vendors that we looked at were affected by our findings. We found that for some of the readers, for iZettle, for SumUp, and for the Mura reader, that we can send arbitrary commands to the display of these devices. This means that a fraudulent merchant could easily socially engineer a cardholder to carry out additional payments, or as we mentioned, to carry out less secure payments. We also mentioned that for certain transaction types, so for magnetic stripe, for the SumUp and iZettle reader, it was possible for us to modify the value of the transaction. So this means we can send a much lower value amount to the screen of the reader and in fact force the cardholder to authorize a much higher value. We also found a remote code execution vulnerability in the Mura M010 reader, which was present with a number of the vendors. We were surprised to find that the security mechanisms in these products are relatively high given the value of these products. And a little bit disappointed to find that the mobile ecosystem wasn't very well protected. So this brings us on to our conclusions. For manufacturers, we recommend that you implement strong security practices in the development process. We can see clear evidence of this in the physical security mechanisms, but we don't think that the ecosystem is considered as a whole for many of these vendors. You should use a Bluetooth pairing mode that visually confirms that the correct device and correct phone have been paired. It's really important to control the signing of firmware and to encrypt firmware so you can prevent interception via sniffing or prevent modification of the firmware itself. And just an important note again about Bluetooth, there's no user authentication or input sanitization, so you have to consider this at the application level. For vendors that we recommend that you don't use deprecated protocols, sometimes this is outside of the scope of a vendor, in which case you could speak to the manufacturer or at least ask them to provide you with features which help you to protect against some of the issues that we've discussed today. You should use preventative monitoring as best practice. So this means looking for anomalies in transactions and using things like correlation, which is a highly effective way of identifying fraudulent merchants. And of course, prohibit downgrades, because one of the vulnerabilities that we mentioned today is specifically around downgrading the firmware on the reader. Place more emphasis on enrollment checks. Purely this is the gateway to your environment, so it's very important to do this. For merchants, we recommend that you control physical access to the devices. This is because many of the attacks or vulnerabilities we've mentioned involve some level of proximity in order to carry out the attacks. If at all possible, we recommend that you don't actually take swipe transactions and instead use chip and signature or chip and pin. We've mentioned many of the reasons as to why you should do this, because you are accepting liability for the value of the transaction every time you accept a swipe transaction. If at all possible, you should try to assess the ecosystem. Now, this isn't very feasible for a company which just has one card reader, but there are some businesses which do have many units. And you should place emphasis on choosing a vendor who protects as much of the ecosystem as possible. For cardholders, we recommend that you don't carry out swipe transactions. And of course, it's just really good practice to look at your monthly statements. So we'd just like to thank you for listening to the presentation of our findings, and also mention that this work couldn't have actually happened without the help of our colleagues and friends. So Artem carried out a huge amount of work identifying the remote code execution vulnerability on the Mura M010 reader. And our colleagues Alexei and Mark, they helped us to look at the internal workings of these readers to identify the security mechanisms. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please let us know.